And there's a difference between
legalization and
yes, right. And a country that is an example of this is Portugal. In Portugal in 2001, they decriminalized the possession of small quantities of drugs, including heroin and cocaine. They were not made legal. It is still an administrative offense. You can be made to pay a fine. You can go in front of a dissuasion panel in Portugal. And they enforce very strictly laws dealing with the trafficking of drugs. And since 2001, the amount of drug use in Portugal has declined. The rate of HIV infection has declined. It hasn't become a drug tourist place in the way that Amsterdam used to have a reputation as a drug tourist place. And it has been a very successful effort to decriminalize possessions of small quantities. I would still make criminal the possession of large quantities to sell, or those who actually engage in sales, or those who engage in any violence in connection with drugs. So the difference between legalization and decriminalization is essentially that.
Mr. Cuéllar, you're being a free rider here.
I'm not being a free rider. I'm just sitting to the right.
Well, I'm just going to bring it back into the discussion. In one sense, given the Attorney General's suggestion that the federal government would not prosecute in states that had, in some ways, decriminalized use of marijuana for medical purposes, the administration is pursuing a decriminalized strategy. Is that a fair way to put it?
I strongly dispute the premise of the question, but it's a fair question. So
but now you can correct the.
I can. So I appreciate the question. The Controlled Substances Act is going to be enforced. Congress has made the decision that marijuana is a Schedule I drug. That's not changing from one administration to another. The reality here, though, is every administration has to ask itself, where are you going to focus your resources? I think everybody on this panel, notwithstanding the differences of opinion we have legitimately on a bunch of different issues, would agree with one basic principle, which is you cannot expect federal prosecutors to have the authority to prosecute every single thing under the sun. And you wouldn't want to imagine a country where those resources would be there, and that would be true. Given that, we have to make legitimate choices about where our priorities are going to be. And what the Deputy Attorney General communicated to U.S. attorneys through guidance, which is an entirely appropriate thing for a Deputy Attorney General to do, is our priorities are on violent crime, they're on large drug trafficking organizations, they're on people who distribute these drugs in violation of state and federal law, which means that in the grand scheme of things, you get to focus on priorities that we think are more important for the country. But that doesn't mean that people who are violating the law should feel like they can do so with impunity. Now, and let me just say one other thing. That's not a policy that everyone will agree with, but we should get the facts right, and furthermore, we can have debates back and forth about how to do this right, but it is important to recognize what the policy really is.
Does anyone subscribe to the view that drugs at any level should be decriminalized, as Mr. Neier suggested?
No, I want to respond to that, but I don't want to advocate it.
Well,
I think you've got to make a distinction between criminalization and decriminalization. To begin with, drug offenses were regulatory offenses, and they grow out of putting a criminal penalty on a regulation. Again, I go back to what I talked about in terms of the federal role on regulation. Federal regulations that carry a penalty, even though prosecutors don't ever distinguish, they're not really, quote, crimes in the pure sense if we had the longer discussion about this. The big moral offenses that we criminalize are fundamentally the prerogative of the states. The federal government just cannot do this very well. And regulation, if you say that what we're doing is we're regulating drugs from the federal level and we're leaving criminalization to the states, then you'd have a very different kind of attitude towards this, and it wouldn't pose the question either you're for drugs or you're against drugs. That's not the question. It is a more involved, multi-layered issue.
Yes, Mr. Walters?
I think we're, again, part of the transition in our understanding of the drug problem is reflected in this discussion. If we are going to control the disease of this, we need to control both the understanding of the seriousness of this and and appreciate the way in which the law is a teacher of what society stands for and doesn't. That doesn't mean the law has to enforce every sanction of human behavior, that's obvious. But it does mean that when we suggest that something that we have had a particularly strong stance is something we want to change, it's an issue. Now, my colleague again brought up Portugal. If we were sitting here 5 years ago, he would have brought up the Netherlands, or maybe Great Britain, who had decriminalized and were famous for it. The reason I suggest he didn't do that is because both of them are trying to rapidly reverse course because of the consequences they saw. Portugal is now the favorite example of those who want to decriminalize because both the data is not very thorough and pretty shoddy. And of course, we have had experiences. Almost every country that has tried to decriminalize substances of abuse has had to reverse course, sometimes over courses of history with shocking consequences. If you want to go back to China and opium in the last century or before. So the problem is we've learned the hard way that these are diseases that can be spread, and when that unless we take a stand that both helps people avoid them, treats people who are victims, and cuts off the supply. You can't encourage consumption of something and then try to cut off the supply. I mean, that was the model of alcohol prohibition that created a market. So you need to be able to discourage, not with maximum mandatory minimums in all cases, but with proportional sanctions and proportional effort to try to encourage people not to use. Let me just say one other point on this, because I want to make the point, and maybe it's considered unfair or blood in the water, but Open Society Institute is funded as one of its chief recipients of money, the Drug Policy Foundation and their leadership. Pointed out in a recent radio interview here, I happened to hear because I was in the dentist's office. It was a double trip to the dentist. They take pride in, they wrote the ballot initiatives for medical marijuana. They're now working on multiple ballot initiatives to decriminalize drugs, beginning with marijuana, but they're quite candid, and there are things you can go on the web, the source of all wisdom, and see that they want to decriminalize. Now, maybe my colleague doesn't, but he's being a little disingenuous that he's funding people who are quite decidedly in one direction. But
we have a small grant to the Hudson Institute, but that doesn't make me responsible for the views you express.
Well, absolutely, but you're not the only funder of these major efforts. But let me just say one other thing about prevention and why this is a problem, because I think you have to look at our cultural history. If you haven't already, go home tonight or go home after this lunch and type into Google marijuana or type into YouTube marijuana and see what young people are exposed to. When you talk about the family, and I agree, it has to be where it starts, but the reality of our teenagers is when they see this, they see multiple instructions and encouragement to use and become involved in substance abuse. That's the education our society is still given. Now, as a free society, we can't take that away. But when we talk about how we're going to control this, the law and the leadership of the nation is a big thing, and is an important has an important role in the lesson it teaches, in the way it teaches that lesson, and in how it talks about this. That's why it is important what the President of the United States does, what the Attorney General does, what the Director of Drug Control Policy does, in addition to what parents do, because we either enforce or undermine that, and there is this standing and difficult problem coming from my generation of baby boomers, which some of you are as well. Bad example and cultural echo that is living in the lives of young people generation after generation, encouraging them to make themselves sick.
I can see that Mr. Baker's
Can I
blood
respond
pressure.
to one thing?
Well, Mr. Baker's blood pressure,
We
I
need
can
a
see from
buffer
here his blood
between
pressure.
these two anyway. Look, I want to talk about this business of the law as moral teacher. The law certainly is a teacher, and criminal law is primarily a vehicle of moral teaching. But when it comes to the federal government, it is one thing for the president in his person to be an example and to be a moral teacher. It doesn't follow that police forces at the federal level should become the moral enforcers. There's a big difference.